Oh folks, this video is of my build of this kitchen table. It was inspired by an Instagram post by Xavier Mas out of Barcelona. It's made from quarter sawn white oak and it measures approximately 60 inches by 36 inches. The first step in the process is retrieving the material. In this case, I've got approximately 50 board feet of quarter sawn white oak 4/4. I'll let this material sit on this cart in the shop for 10 days to 2 weeks before I really start in on working with it. The tabletop is going to be 5 feet long by 3 feet wide. The lumber I've got is roughly 11 to 12 feet in length. So what I'm going to do here first is to do the tabletop. I will cut members in half to make them more manageable, and then I will go through and plane those and build the top from them. Once I've got these to a more manageable size, I'll move over to the planer. The rough material is 4/4, but it's been run through a planer at the lumber yard, which they call skip planing. Since this is going to be a tabletop, I'm not too interested in taking it all the way down to 3/4 of an inch. I'm running it through the planer just to make sure I've got good surface area on both sides and they're all the equal thickness. In this case, I've got about 7/8 of an inch thick for the tabletop. In addition to skip planing each surface, the lumber yard also gives me one finished edge. The other edge is rough and not necessarily parallel to the finished edge. This finished edge gives me a starting point to rip down the lumber to finished width. What I'm doing here is maximizing the width I can get out of each board. Basically, I'm cutting out any of the rough spots on the board and maintaining the maximum width I can get. I've got a newly sharpened blade and my last rip is about a half a kerf thick. This precludes me from having to run these through a jointer to get a fine edge for glue up. Prior to glue up, I mark and cut slots for biscuits. I'm putting biscuits on 6-inch centers. I ended up with 7 planks for the tabletop. To make things easier and less complicated, I did this in multiple stages. I glued up 3 at a time, giving me just 2 joints to work with. And then once I had those 2 panels done, I glued those together with the single 7th panel in the middle, thus giving me only 2 wet glue lines on that effort as well. Here are the 2 panels sitting in the clamps waiting to dry. Now, as I mentioned, I take the 2 3-panel sections and then glue in between a single 7th slat to make up the total width of the tabletop. While I let the glue dry in the tabletop, I'll start in on the legs, or what I think I'll refer to as a stand, because the legs are not separate, it's all one piece. This process starts about the same way as doing the tabletop. I cut the long 11-12 foot sections of lumber down to manageable lengths, and then I rip them to width that I'm going to use to build the stand. At this stage, I was not sure how this stand was going to come together, so I did a full-scale sketch. There's going to be a top and bottom section that are identical, and then there'll be the four legs that slope inward from the bottom section up to the top. I cut all the pieces for the stand to extra long length. I determined the slope of the legs and then decided that the connection would be such that the end grain of the horizontal portion of the stand bottom would be hidden by the leg itself. Here you can get an idea of how this joint at the bottom is going to come together. Now that I've figured out how to make the joint between the legs and the bottom portion of the stand, I need to figure out how to make this connection. After scratching my head, I came up with the idea of using dowels in multiple directions. Having decided on the connection type, I go about cutting the pieces to match that connection layout. Here I am cutting the 45, and then there needs to be a stub taken off of that 45 slope. The top and bottom of the stand are essentially identical, with the exception of where the vertical pieces connect to the upper portion. I also extended the length of the wishbone portions of the upper stand to give more stability to the table. After feeling confident that I've got the leg/stand mechanism figured out, I turned back to the tabletop. Here I am manhandling the top up back to the work table. It's a matter of using the track saw to bring the tabletop to its final dimensions. With the tabletop cut to final dimensions and ready for sanding, I jump back to the table stand itself. Here I am drilling counterbores into the bottom portions of the legs to attach to the bottom portion of the stand. While at the drill press, I'm putting some counterbores in to put some little leveling feet in case I need to use those to level the table once it's installed in its final location. Now that I've got all of the pieces for the stand cut, it's time to drill for the dowels. I'm using a self-centering dowel drilling jig. My assembly process on the base is to put what I'll call the wishbones together first, let them set up, and then put those on the ends of the two lateral members. In order to clamp these 45-degree wishbones together, I've taken the 45-degree portions that I sawed off and am CA gluing them on the opposite side. Here I am gluing up one of the wishbones. You'll notice that the dowel is off center from the 45-degree cut. This is to allow space so that the dowels that come in from the other joint won't impinge on that dowel. In order to get a nice good clean seam, putting the wishbones on the lateral pieces, I took them back to the table saw and just trimmed ever so little bit off to get me a nice good clean cut. After the wishbone joint has dried and I shaved off that little bit to get a nice clean seam, I then drilled dowel holes for assembly. Note again that I'm using the 45-degree cutoffs as clamping cauls. I'm attaching the vertical sections of the stand with Craig 2-inch pocket hole screws. I use these because they have a nice flat bearing surface on the head. After I assembled the bottom portion of the stand, I was able to set the top on the vertical members and mark where the intersection would be, where they would connect to the upper member. I now am drilling counterbores so that I can set the screws into the top. I'm sure there would have been a way to calculate where this intersection point would be, and I could have drilled these on the drill press, but I was still hesitant to go through all that math, and this worked just fine. Then it was a matter of applying some glue and setting the top portion back on the stand. I'm hand tightening these so that I don't split out the end grain of the vertical members. To add additional strength and to keep the table from swaying any, I'm adding little gusset plates to the stand. These will be up underneath the tabletop and will not be seen unless you're really down on the ground level. With the gusset plates attached, there's just a couple other items here to take care of before I can finish it. One, plug those holes and sand them off, and I wanted to put the top on the stand and then disassemble it before I finish it. I'm using General Finish Clear Coat, a water-based product, in gloss. I'm applying 7 coats on the top for wear purposes. I'm using a high volume, low pressure sprayer, and I'm putting on very thin coats, and I cross hatch at 90 degrees to make sure I get good coverage. And there it is, the finished table sitting in the kitchen. I hope you enjoyed watching me assemble this table and maybe even picked up a few pointers. Happy woodworking.